All right. Hey, you guys. Thanks for coming on the chat with me. On Twitter, I asked a question about what can we do to bring into the world or solve maybe for a bottom-up intergenerational detotalitarianization, and I'll unpack the terms a bit. I think the world is going a little bit too much into a state where lots of power and control is going to certain power structures, to where individuals don't have that much to say or feel they even have a thing to say. And it's been happening, I think, for a few decades, but now with the internet coming up, people are losing their attention for each other, I think, and putting their attention in things that I would say maybe matter less, but it means also giving away their control, and it means not having to control themselves. And I think it results in people feeling less free, and even maybe on a more spiritual level, that their soul is less free. So if everyone has to like the same thing, for example, then your creative expression is lower. You can you get like a suppression of the individual or the mind or the soul, if you want to say it in a more spiritual sense. And I think you cannot solve that through a top-down way. So that's why I came up with bottom-up. It has to come from a grassroots movement, from individuals that maybe feel connected to each other. But it's not something I think that you can do in a few years. So that's how I came with intergenerational. You try to pass along that idea to, well, at least multiple generations, to detotalize, like to make the world less centralized, less authoritative, and eventually maybe more equal. I wouldn't say more equal, because the world things aren't equal, but more opportunity at least to eventually express yourself, your soul, become your true self maybe. So that's what I was thinking. I have some thoughts about this. But on Twitter, Visa said, hey, you maybe should talk to Gabe, VividVoid, and Rich. They've been in this scene a bit. And, well, that's how we now finally met each other. So I'm really curious about what you think about these terms and, well, how we could probably solve this. Maybe we should start with the question of why should we try to do this, and is it something we want to try at all? Is it a good thing to try? I'm not sure who wants to start on this. Gabe, do you want to start?
Jump into it. Yeah. So I mean, first off, thanks for having us here, Gibran. This is awesome. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. Yeah, get some thoughts out there, and have a long form talk with both of you guys. So, what a pleasure. So I bottom up intergenerational detotalization, detotalitarianization. The first thing that comes to mind as a one working model of this is Buddhism. In the sense that, sort of when the Buddha talks about liberation, he's explicitly talking about liberation from social convention. He's explicitly talking about liberation from authoritarianism, and maybe especially Zen Buddhism, because it's a mix of Tao and Buddhism. And Taoism has been used successfully, or was used successfully, as a counterpoint to Confucianism for centuries. And with sort of the entire thing being that, the socially constructed virtues, such as they are, sort of always contain the seeds of their own demise. They always contain, the seeds. They'll always contradict themselves if you take them far enough, right? And so there's great wisdom in not analyzing and not having your mind to be hyperactive, and in just relaxing and letting the world bring through you what the world wants to bring through you, and kind of the principles of growth and the principles of sort of natural flow, I guess. And I think that's one example. I think there are others, right? Like I think Jungian individuation is another good example of something like this, which is sort of like creative pursuits, sort of spiritual pursuits via art. So, Vasily Kandinsky wrote a wonderful book called Concerning the Spiritual in Art. It's very much concerned with individuation around the same time as Jung. That which sort of brings forth what we think of as the spirit, or what we think of as that sort of je ne sais quoi, in a human being that's that we know but can't know, that we recognize but can't know. I don't know of any way to systematize individuation, and Buddhism obviously is sort of has been operating at the limits of its capacity for a long time in terms of influence. So and both of these approaches, such as they are, not that they're the only two, but both of these approaches have been confounded in a lot of ways by the new pressures of social media and the new I shouldn't say the new pressures, I should say the new intensity of pressure that's been introduced by social media. So social media has really ratcheted up pressure to follow convention, especially socio-political conventions, really up to like 11, in the Spinal Tap sense. It's like really intense. So I don't think that's new necessarily, but it's but the intensity is new in societies that previously thought of themselves as being pretty freewheeling, particularly the States, and Western Europe, where you guys are at. So, so I guess the question to me is like, is this possible? Because I think it's obviously possible. The question is like, how do we find something effective for the 21st century? What do we need to renew? What do we need to invent? What do we need to make happen?
Yeah, I'm with you. I noticed, Gibran, when you introduced this topic, quite a familiar posture in me, which is like to disagree with a lot of the framing, and I want to bring that as my this is my way to play and make friends, is to disagree, and that opens up a certain amount of space, and then we can populate. It's like opening up the canvas, and then we start painting on it. So, for example, I think you are saying that, kind of saying that there's too much control in society right now, and therefore we lack freedom. And I get that, I experience that too, but I also experience the opposite, that there's too much freedom. It seems like both things are happening at the same time. There's this like excess of order and control, and we're like being incorporated into this machine. And there's an excess of freedom and decoupling, coming apart from each other, and transhumanism. You can just even the body is no longer a constraint, and the whole postmodern move of like we're just going to deconstruct everything and show how it's all arbitrary. I think we're suffering from both at the same time, and so like I'm not necessarily in the business of producing more freedom on its own. It's more like somehow finding a different balance or a different formula between the order and the freedom and the form, or something like that. So that's one piece of it, and then bottom up. I also have a little cringe with, because like Gabe mentioned Taoism, and I don't know much about these philosophies, but my understanding of Taoism is that the Tao is not something that arises bottom up, like that exists in the cosmos, and you as an individual or as a small agent make your choices and try and align yourself with the Tao. But the Tao is this like global constraint that you can sense your way into, and if you live in accordance with it, then you're gonna be a benefit to other people, something like that. So there's this there is a global constraint which is not emergent from the bottom up. It actually emanates from the top down. And again, so this is a question of balance, and I want to. I hope you forgive me. I want to do a little rant, just to open up some space, right? So just to give you the way that I think, my business is mostly about community building and building kinds of communities which are about, they're kind of about personal development in good company. That's kind of the gist of them. So we are trying to do this de-totalitarianism together, like learn how do we come out of these authoritarian patterns into more equitable patterns. And the main theoretical frame that I use for thinking about that is this like infinitely long stack of nested circles. And so at the very tiny end, you have like subatomic particles that then come together into atoms and then into molecules and then into the different little machines inside of our cells, and then on and on and on. You know, it goes up and up and up and up until you get to a body, this character me. And each of those stages up as you're going up in scale, like there's a bottom up and a top down thing happening simultaneously. You know, so like you need the universal laws of physics before you're going to have molecules. And you also need the molecules to be coming together in the right way. Like there is a bottom up and a top down that's happening simultaneously. And so like I really want to attend to what are the large scale contexts that we're in, because they have a huge impact on whatever our bottom up changes and choices are. And of course I go from I just got as far as the individual, but then I just keep going up in scale from small groups to large groups to nations and species and so on. And some of those really large scale structures like gender, for example, or national identity have a huge impact on what we think is possible. And say you're raising kids and you're trying to do this project of like liberation, if you're not attending to what's happening in your country, it's like you're making these small adjustments while the whole playing field is moving drastically. And so yeah, it's really important to me that we're not just focused on the bottom up, that we're not just focused on the local and what's in front of us, but also paying attention to the larger context that we're in. And that's kind of my understanding of the Tao. You know, it's like there is a big thing out there, there is weather, and we've got a boat and we're adjusting our sails, but we don't control the weather. Maybe it sounds like you want to have a bit of an influence on the weather, so we can go there as well. And then I'm with you on intergenerational. That word I've got no complaints with. That's awesome, because for me that situates us in an appropriate level of humility, and it's like a doable task to raise a generation that is maybe is in some ways more mature than the previous generation. We can do that, but I'm not really interested in this idea of like saving the world or something, or doing some kind of transformation over the next 10-year project. It just doesn't sound very interesting to me. And so then we get to de-totalitarianism, and my issue with that, apart from all the syllables, is that it's framed in the negative, and the main reason that I'm in this conversation is because I want Visa to be proud of me, and he would tell us to focus on what you want to see more of, right? And that means not framing it in the negative. And so I'm curious to work out with you what's the positive framing, like what's the actual values or the behaviors or the end state that we're aiming for. What would happen if we had less totalitarianism? What's the thing that emerges? What's the positive? Because if we're just steering away from the negative, there's an infinite number of directions of ways that you can steer away from something when it doesn't give you any clarity about which way to go. And my proposal, I mean, the first thing I heard from Gabe was about liberation, so that's interesting. But the word that I use in my work is partnership, and that comes from Rian Eisler, who contrasts partnership and domination. And so domination for me, I love that word because it's like it connects the totalitarianism of the state to the totalitarianism of the family. It's both domination at different scales, and it adapts very well to different axes of domination, whether it's about class or gender or anything else. And then partnership being the alternative to that, being we keep our difference. Like you say, we're not equal. We're not all the same. We're different. But there's a way of combining our differences in partnership, meaning we're greater than the sum of our parts. Where each of us has a gift to offer and something to learn from the other. And that most of us have been trained and conditioned for domination relationships. We're like constantly tracking the ranking and how can I be the coolest guy? You know, I'm really upset that Gabe's beard is a little bit more impressive than mine, and I'm thinking about my status points as a result. That's a domination instinct in me that's like tracking the ranking, right? But we could also be in partnership where I'm like, wow, I wonder what I've got to learn from Gabe from his awesome beard care.
It's objectively untrue, Rich. This is clear.
Beautiful. So yeah, I think a part of my introduction of the topic is also a limit of my English or even the how do you say it, the definition, because to answer your question, how would you define not the negative, but what would the positive be of detotalization or you know, the long word. I would say I think it's a self-expression, or what I would like to see is that, like, we're with 8 billion people on this planet, and what I would like to see is that people have the opportunity to express, I would say, their true self, and then you can of course discuss what is true self, but to express in a sense maybe like your authentic self, that you're not that it's not oppressed. But oppression does not necessarily come from only the state. It can come from your family, friends, your community, but also from yourself, from internal systems, really. So I think so. I indeed I wouldn't want to look at it in just the context of the state or control structures there. It's all fractals in a sense, where at some place something is looks like top down or authoritarian, but if you look at it from a higher level, it's actually a system that creates a bottom up process, like you said, like in nature. You know, the DNA structure or genes structure your cells, but the cells create opportunity for your organs to exist, well, etc. I think you explained it yourself with the atoms as well. So yeah, I think it's a good that you're jumping into, and that you're showing your disagreement, or actually just maybe help me better define the terms of what I'm trying to figure out. So how would you, either of you, describe? So if you wouldn't want to use the word detotalization or detotalitarianization, or how would you feel you would describe it? You said partnership, Rich, I think. How would you describe it, Gabe? Or
I think, real quick, one thing I want to jump in and say is I speak one language, and so you're killing it as far as I'm concerned with it. So I'm just impressed when anybody speaks more than one.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. I think I love that contrast of partnership and domination. I think that's wonderful. I think I don't think domination is bad, and there are times that totalitarianization is not bad, right? Like, there are times when you actually may need to force everyone to get on the same page for survival, or for those sorts of things. I don't think, as a general mode of living, this is a good thing. I'm tempted to bring in, like, to talk about Gramsci and talk about hegemony and these kinds of ideas. But I feel like that's jumping straight to politics, and we're going to get into get into waters I'm not sure I personally want to swim in for very long. Rich, you said that there's sort of there's a million or maybe infinite different ways you can go that are not de-totalitarianization, right? But this kind of uniquely, this concept of, like, the minute that you go away from totalitarianization, you go in a million different directions. You can go in a million different directions, is, like, exactly what you want. That's exactly what the opposite of totalitarian thought should be. but I think a lot of times, or maybe something that's really important to understand is at the level that's underneath. I don't think totalitarianism or hegemony or these systems of control are there because somebody was like, I'm gonna enslave the human spirit, you know. Like our world is extraordinarily complex, and it's far more complex than the current ideological governing structures can handle. Which is why we're in this kind of unique situation where most of our countries are out of integrity, telling a story about who we are as a people that's totally at odds with the systems of control and that are required to govern us. A lot of this is born out of the natural sort of like frustration of things, and a lot of this is born out of a real deep dissatisfaction, I think, with something you talked about, with lack of meaning, without feeling like there's a lack of purpose, and the sort of thing that tends to spring up when people are bored and frustrated and lacking purpose, especially when the middle class is this way, is you start to get mass movements. You start to get a kind of psychology that really lends itself well to mass movements, really lends itself well to totalitarian type of thinking, because people are really searching for relief from a spiritual malady or an emotional malady that's quite painful. You know, it's a lack of faith. It's a lack of any buffer between you and kind of like the terror of being a very mortal, short-lived ape that's kind of, with us most of the time, and there's all kinds of stories you want to fill things up with, and I think that makes us vulnerable, So to the extent that there was, like a lot of good traditional wisdom that was being passed down sort of in what you would think of like as a small c conservative tradition. A lot of it came out of like Christianity, like Quakers. There was a lot of really like good wholesome stuff that got passed down that formed the basis of culture, and it failed, in the age of mass media. It really came apart. And there were many good things about it. There were many bad things about it. It personally, failed me, but, sort of in the imperfect vessels of my own parents and my own community. But there's no return to that. There's, like whatever, like Wendell Berry goodness is still there. Like maybe can serve as the seeds of a renewal of some sort. I don't think that we're going to be able to sort of like look to the past, or I don't think there's any way to like sort of turn back the clock. Like anything that we're going to be able to do is going to have to like liberate the spirit of the age. The sort of the current zeitgeist. There's no going back to anything.
I agree that backwards is not the place to look. But maybe I'm a little bit optimistic, because kind of like the Tao, I do think the answers are lying around in the present moment, always accessible to everyone if they just know how to turn their shoulder and look at it. I was chatting with someone recently, and they were describing that they're connected with a bunch of different indigenous communities around the world, and part of their project is about kind of archiving and holding on to old knowledge. And the question is, what do we do if we lose the knowledge? And from multiple communities from different parts of the globe, the answer is it's kind of not the end of the world if we lose our traditions, because the knowledge just lives in the forest. It's like, it's just present. As soon as you can tune your attention and your awareness in a certain way, the right thing to do is kind of obvious. I wondered if it's useful to zoom in a few clicks before we get to Gramsci and I really get out of my depth. And think about totalitarianism at quite a small scale. So I was thinking about my experience of groups. As soon as you have like 30 plus people who are trying to be organized, they're trying to do something, and sometimes even at smaller scales, but it gets really obvious around then. Because you can't, 30 people can't hold shared context about each other in real time. They kind of usually they need some kind of agreements or like written policies or, some kind of set of norms or principles to govern them. Yeah, you get this kind of like, how are we going to organize? And most of the groups that I've been in that had any sense of deep connection and momentum had a kind of totalitarian bias in them. And as in, the way to belong here is to think the same as the other people. And there's a kind of current of deep concern if someone demonstrates that they have a different way of seeing the world. We're kind of afraid of different perspectives. And then at the other end of the scale, you have this kind of, I'm thinking about my peers sort of in my university days that just went super nihilistic because of basically the cultural relativism, they're like, oh, we can't agree on anything, all the perspectives are valid, there's no meaning, there's no purpose, and I was wondering, for both of you guys, first of all, if you agree that you see this totalitarianism emerge at a very small scale, and if so, how do you think about that? Like, where do you think that instinct comes from? Like, why are we so focused on unity and conformity? Like, why do we need to collapse all the different possibilities down into one way of seeing the world? And why is it rare to be in a group that can actually hold pluralistic perspectives?
I can say a little bit about it, also from university years and friend groups and different communities I've been in. I think it's important to most people to feel connected, and feel safe. And if you have people in the same group that think differently, it could be unsafe because they might act in a way that you don't expect, and if they act in a way you don't expect, it can be dangerous. Of course, it doesn't necessarily have to be so, and most of the times it isn't. But I can imagine that's been with us since evolution. From evolution, if you can't trust really what someone is going to do, then it's unsafe, and then it may not be part of a group, or it may be better if they're an outsider in a sense. And I'm not sure if that's something that we can get rid of or want to get rid of, or maybe a better way, how can we use that to our advantage? But I think the danger there is if you have a group that's 1 billion people big in China, let's say, and everyone has to think the same, then if there's someone at the top, like you said earlier, Rich, that can maybe move the field without many people not even knowing, then it becomes dangerous. But in a very small group, it's very useful. At least it helps in the survival of that group, I think, to try to keep people in alignment on the same views. Not sure, Gabe, you've been in the military, right? Have you do you have experiences that relate to this, maybe, on Rich's question?
Yes. Yeah, in the military, it's a matter of life or death. Everybody, and maybe there's some lessons that we can. This is a fine way into it. I need to know when lives are on the line. I need to know not just that everybody is going to behave in a way that makes sense to me. That we have like a sense making apparatus that operates more or less in the same way, but also that other people, that we're all going to follow established protocols that we know are the most effective and that have been tested over time to be the most effective, because the stakes are too high. To some extent, right? So I'm saying this, and people always hold up the military as this like, sort of incredibly like rigid conformist organization, which is funny in a lot of ways, because that's because it's not true. It's right. There's like a really strict structure for some things, and that structure's whole thing is to enable creativity and explosiveness, and individual decision making on the battlefield. So the whole purpose of it is like is deeply or like really powerful control on the things that can be, and not trying to control the things that you shouldn't. So we have a good example in this case of Rich's model of something that we've kind of figured out for fighting wars. The stuff that has to come from top down comes from top down, and the stuff that has to come from bottom up has to come from the bottom up. And this is maybe not the case with all military organizations. I was in the Marine Corps, which is very specifically sort of like built around improvisation and being able to shift very quickly with changing battlefield conditions. But maybe the way into talking about like why humans need this or why people need this, I think comes down. I think it's because the stakes are pretty high in everyday life too. Falling in love is an incredibly high stakes thing. Whether or not you belong to your community is pretty high stakes. Like whether or not you can feed yourself because you're able to get a job and like fit in with the culture and not be disruptive is high stakes. It may be not as immediately high stakes as like shit's blowing up, whatever. But it's less dramatic. But I don't think the stakes are substantially lower. So that would be why I think people it's terrifying to think that you would have to be experimenting in realms, where your like family's ability to eat is on the line, and where these like short years that we get on the planet are like on the line. That's difficult, So I think that people are constantly looking for conventions, and they're constantly looking for rules that we know, and they're constantly looking for education and protocols, things that they can ensure success, guarantee success. But when you get enough of these things and stitch them all together, you get common sense, right? You get sort of like this basic fabric of a culture that like culture approaches the various domains of life in these ways, and then you practice those long enough over generations, and that's what becomes like just the way we do things. It's just we just because this is what works. Why would you ask questions about that? That's ridiculous. And this is also precisely what totalitarian and authoritarian type people work on, is the common sense. It's precisely what they want to change. It's precisely what they want. They're not interested in having things be debated. They're interested in getting into the level of things that that people don't even realize is open for debate, is open to question. Because opening that question is too high stakes. So we like to keep it in the background. We like to keep it somewhere that, we don't have to think about it too hard because we know it's working, right?
Maybe a question that follows up from this. If that's the case, that it essentially it's the changing of people's minds of the things that they aren't maybe even paying attention to. They are not sure what things are changed, maybe within themselves without them knowing, and what would be a way to help people realize that their ideas are changing over time. I mean, if I look at some close family members, I've seen them swing along with whatever's in the news, sometimes completely the opposite of what they were thinking 5 or 10 years ago, and then switching back. And I mean, we all have that. We're constantly changing our minds. But how can we be mindful of their thoughts being changed? How can they be more attentive to that?
I think I can have a crack at that. Like, how do we show people that their minds have been changed by some external force? I guess I have a question, which is my I guess my worldview assumes that there is something like an inner compass, that there is a way of like developing a kind of self-awareness and a aesthetic discernment, which is related to a moral discernment, that there is a way of like just listening to the world and getting feedback loops between like your behavior and your beliefs and like what's happening around you and what kind of impact you're having on others, that like that your brain is somehow capable of integrating all of that information and producing a dashboard with a compass on it that says this is good, this way is growth, this way is development, this way is evolution, this way is some kind of pro-social values, and then we can cultivate that internally, that kind of interior capacity, and the job is to like support lots of people to develop their inner compass, and trust that they're all going to disagree a little bit. That's a sign that the inner compass is working well. But if they have that inner compass installed, then they're less susceptible to whatever popular movements and demagogues and propaganda that's just kind of like grabbing them by the brainstem and saying, this thing is bad and this thing is good, come with me. Maybe less susceptible to the dopamine hits.
Yeah, and yeah, Rich, I love the way you described that. It's, you know, in Western psychology, that's the definition of the personality. I mean, you basically nailed it. But it's what we think of as a personality. It's the space of meaning making that's oriented toward truth, right? The idea is that people will naturally grow in the way they'll naturally grow according to a kind of phenomenologic that is sort of all their own, but also shared. It's something we all sort of understand. If you get things out of the way that are preventing that growth, it's like all of us are oriented towards truth. All of us are oriented towards growth, as long as something doesn't get in the way. And there are things that can stop that up and try to sort of like turn a human being toward its own purpose, right? And these are kind of, you know, totalizing memes, or sometimes people, you know, in our group of friends like to call them egregores or something like this, right? Or it's like, which I don't fully subscribe to the way that we tend to use that.
I want to nudge on this some more. So like,
yeah, go ahead.
I do have concerns. You know, before someone said authenticity or self-expression, or like you just said, things can get in the way of maybe your like natural state or your natural form. I have a concern with that, you know. So like, I was sitting out here on my back porch, and it was winter, and so I could see this big tree in my backyard with no leaves on it, and so I could see the structure of the tree and how bizarre it was, because it was obviously a tree that had spent its first 20 years receiving a lot of attention and pruning and shaping, and then the next 20 years no one had touched it, and so it was this like very orderly at the bottom and very chaotic at the top. And it made me think about, I thought, you know, my first impression was like, oh, someone's really made a mess of this tree. What would the tree have looked like if it wasn't interfered with? And the answer is, there is no tree if it's not being interfered with. Yeah. You know, that the tree is, there is no platonic tree. You know, it's like it's always an interaction with the fungi and the atmosphere and the rainfall and everything else. You know, that partly it's there is a pattern encoded into its DNA, but it's a pattern that every single instantation of it is going to look different, because it's always going to have different contextual factors. And there's no way to strip away those. If you take away those contextual factors, you don't have a tree anymore. And so that's my way of thinking. This is also my grizzle with the idea of an individual. Like, if you take away all the relationships and all the culture and all the influences, there's nothing left. You know, you don't even make it past day one of being born. So I can't really buy this idea that there's obstacles and then you just get rid of the obstacles and then we have some kind of, you know, flourishing being. It's like, we're all chained to each other. We're all entangled in each other all the time, and there's no escaping that. And it's just like, how do we be responsive to each other's needs and the impact that we're having, so that I can kind of over time notice like, hey, my way of interacting with you is like shielding you from the sun, and you're growing in this really weird stunted direction, and can we share the space a bit more equally? But I don't have a sense that there's like a kind of blank slate or some kind of way of decoupling the individual from the environment and going like, we just need to return to this state. Is that how you see it, Gabe?
No. Let me try a different way of talking about this. This may be a little better. And so there is such a thing as pruning the tree. Pruning the tree has nothing to do with the tree's roots. Pruning the tree has nothing to do with the pH or the pH of the soil, right? Pruning the tree has nothing to do with how much shade or relative light it's getting, or the climate that it's in, or the amount of sun that it gets, or any of this stuff. All that remains the same. Pruning the tree is shaping the way the tree automatically grows against the way it would have in its climate, with its rhizome, right, in the forest it belonged to, et cetera, et cetera. There is no such thing as a tree that grows outside of a forest and a rhizome and a climate and a whatever. There is such a thing as a tree that grows without pruning. So, to the extent that someone, a human being, gets conditioned in a way that makes them act unconsciously or automatically, whether that's negative or positive, if you've been conditioned into something that's against what we know is good for human beings, what we know is good for human flourishing, then you've been psyoped into behavior that is self-defeating, that's self-sabotaging, and that to me, at least what I've seen almost always, is the seed of the behavior that's antisocial and community sabotaging and is destructive to your external environment. So to the extent, what I'm talking about here is removing conditioning that turns a person against themselves. And even to some extent, removing conditioning that causes automatic behavior that we think of as good or beneficial. Because as we all know, what we thought was good and beneficial 25, 50, 75, 100 years ago, just none of these things are the same really anymore. There's some things that are constant over time, but are we really wise enough to condition for that? Maybe children, yeah, you have to condition children. Right, they're not strong enough. Their prefrontal cortex is not online. Adults, though, do we need to be constantly conditioning adults for good or evil? I'm not sure. I think the less conditioning you get in place, the more you free them to be able to decide for themselves and to really get in touch with what's good for them. And what's good for them will almost always be good for the rhizome and the forest and the climate and the ecosystem that they're a part of, because they're not separate from it.
Okay, so next question. When you described the small-scale totalitarianism, what I heard was kind of like, it's almost like that we have to have this conformity because it's a survival need at some base layer. When the stakes are really high, I need to be able to depend on you, etc. Which then implies that the detotalitarian or the partnership or the liberated way of relating in a group is kind of a luxury. It's kind of like an extra that we get to if we're lucky, if we've got sufficient resources and safety. Which, if that's how you think, that to me is a very pessimistic view. And I want to contrast that with what I've heard from Riane Eisler. She started out as a historian, and her basic argument is that if you look through historical societies, you can see examples of civilizations built around both the domination paradigm and the partnership paradigm, and it's a spectrum, and we've got samples all the way along the spectrum, but that both of those points are kind of stable, and it's not like domination is our native state, and then if we get more civilized, we can act more collaboratively. It's that um, we're kind of like Lego blocks that can be clicked together this way or that way. It's like either we start building relationships around these ranking domination systems, or we build relationships around linking through these partnership systems, and both of those are stable. And the issue with the current society we live in is it's just got way too much historical conditioning around the domination system. And what we're trying to do is like inflate these little bubbles of partnership system, like families and schools and small communities and so on, so that we can start I would say reconditioning rather than deconditioning. Like I think we're just going to be conditioning each other all the time. But I guess my question is, do you think that both of these states are kind of stable, or is it that we need to get our animal needs met, and then we may get when we have enough resources and safety, then we can start being more caring and collaborative and pluralistic?
I think on a societal level, they can both be stable. Like, and the opposite idea can also be a working idea or a right idea. I'm not sure who said something like that, but the two ideas that are opposite can both work. Or so you can have a very dominant system or society that's very stable, and one that's built completely on partnerships, which is stable. And maybe the difficulty is in something in between, and maybe we are there and we need some reconditioning or deconditioning. But what I'm curious about is, let's say you have the society based more on a dominating system. The people living in there, maybe the society is stable, but the people living in there, are they suffering more than they would in a more partnership society or not? So I think that's a very important question to answer. So and looking back at history, I'm not sure if we can answer it. I mean, if you look back at my history is not that strong, but maybe we can look at the current situation. I believe, and I'm not sure, but I believe that people in China that are, you might say, more in a more dominated system, I have the idea they may be less expressive of themselves, and maybe due to that suffering more, or maybe have less happiness or joy. So I think it's important if we have the choice of choosing between the systems, and we can choose a system with less suffering and more joy, I think we should choose that. But if the only choice is no system, so the non-existence of humanity or consciousness versus a system that is maybe more suppressed or dominated, domination built, however you want to call it, then I choose for the one that keeps the light of consciousness alive, I'd say. And we're probably going in like waves, in like nature, like not even just humans, but we go through phases. What I was saying was, the pendulum swings in a sense between maybe the dominant society and the partnership-based society, maybe in like 100-year cycles or whatever.
Yeah, if I can respond to what Rich said, I think that when it comes, I think when it's time to dominate, you dominate, and when it's time to partner, you partner. And I don't think that you can find really easily generalizable principles that are like, this is going to be the best for this and this is going to be the best for that. I think that if you have decided beforehand that dominating or partnering in a given situation is going to be the right thing before you've seen the situation, you're going to have a higher error rate than if you do your best with the information that you've got in the moment where it's at. So ideally, we would have people who understand when they're doing both and it's not unconscious to them. And that's so much of the problem that we have right now, is this unconscious, compulsive domination that lives in the culture. And so much of that is rooted in fear and insecurity and mortality and these things. It's certainly, I've got it too, which I fight with it every day, but because it is unconscious, and I have to remind myself, it's not the only way to be. And if we that I don't believe that that partnership or that cooperation, sort of interindividuality or recognizing our interdependence is only possible as a luxury good. Or we wouldn't have gotten, I think Judaism is like a wonderful example of like a really harsh desert environment where the Jews were constantly subjected to, all manner of hardship and war and strife, and also created this gorgeous way of life that is extremely interconnected and extremely interdependent, and it's because they dominated when it was time to dominate, and they partnered when it was time to partner, and they screwed it up a lot and wrote that down when they screwed it up too, and I think that's that sort of stands as testament to something that we're talking about here, sort of broadly, as to how we're going to do that going forward. There's something to learn from the Jews. There's something to learn from the Buddhists. There's something to learn from the Christians. Everybody, in terms of like where have we screwed this up, and how do we get good at both without getting prejudiced against one or the other, so that when the moment presents itself, we can give it our best.
Yeah, I find myself constantly in this conversation wanting to say both, because you described how people can unconsciously activate these dominator patterns, and both we can also unconsciously activate the reaction against the dominator pattern, which is what a lot of what I saw that drove the polarization around COVID was government saying, hey guys, it's an emergency, we're going to have to be dictators for a second. And there was a lot of people that were just like, oh, there's never a time when the government should impose this degree of limits on my freedom, without any thought process. Just immediately the reaction is like, it smells bad, can't have it. And if you look at from a perspective of safety and number of deaths, the countries that were more willing to submit to some like temporary but intense restrictions were the ones that had fewer deaths. So I think there's like a really sound argument for occasionally flicking between democracy and dictatorship, like in this emergency scenario. And it's just that with dysfunctional bureaucracies and unaccountable legislations and so on, we don't trust that once they flick the switch to dictator, they'll ever flick it off. So for good reason. But where I'm getting to, I think, is confirmation bias, I guess, just like coming back and giving myself a pat on the back. Like the answer to the question, the original question, I feel like is what I'm doing, which is create small groups where people have a direct personal encounter with the trade-offs of being a group, where you can't just be unconsciously susceptible to like too much democracy or too much domination. You actually have to feel it, like, oh, it sucks when we do too much democracy, it doesn't work. But also it sucks when someone is like calling all the shots, and it's a trade-off, and that's where the consciousness is. It's like I've become aware of both ends of the spectrum, and I'm an agent that can move the slider to one side or the other. And in that context, like I'm only talking about groups of less than a couple of hundred people, but it directly informs my participation as a citizen. For example, like my willingness to go through the COVID stuff, like I just mentioned, is vastly increased because I've had to do management trade-offs in small groups. And so I know I can kind of imagine what it must be like to be responsible for a whole country. So yeah, like I say, I'm coming back around to pat myself on the back, but I wonder for the two of you, based on what we've said so far, what seems like right action, like what seems like a good thing to be doing if you want to be into this bottom-up, intergenerational, detotalizing new reality. What do we do, Gabe?
I think you've got to stop watching the media. Like, first and foremost, you've got to get off that shit. I don't know. It would be good to try to get some skills around being able to be critical of what you're reading on social media and being able to be critical of those things as well, because you don't just want to like turn this stuff off and then go to a Facebook group and be doing the same thing. I think I'm going to be that guy. I'm going to go ahead and do it. I think that a contemplative or meditative practice is extraordinarily important here. Taking 15, 20, 30 minutes a day and just sitting and focusing on nothing and really letting all of your thoughts go opens up a space for a different kind of understanding that isn't available otherwise. And this kind of understanding it's an inability to know. And the inability to know and really know that you can't know is one of the most corrosive substances to the totalitarian mindset or to the authoritarian mindset. Is this like not just ability to exist in uncertainty, but this inability to be certain because you've just seen it. It's just not possible. So I think that would be something that would probably be the thing I would recommend for most people. I to some extent, right, like I see schools are doing this a lot. My son is about to go to a school where his first period of every day is mindfulness.
Oh, wow.
Which is wonderful, and also state mandated individuation is hilarious to me because I can't possibly. I have no idea what that's going to look like. I can't wait to hear from him when he gets back and tells me what this, like school assemblies where they all meditate together or something. Like I got to see this for myself and see, what that's going to look like. But I really think creating that space for uncertainty and creating that holding space for yourself, I think is really key.
That's a really interesting connection to my focus on groups, because my experience of doing collective governance is this constant reminder that I can't know. I don't know. Like I've got a perspective, but as soon as I genuinely listen to other people with different experiences, it's like, wow, there's like infinitely more perspectives that are also true that I can't possibly access unless I listen. Like it's never going to arise in me. And so it's another way to practice that not knowing. What about you, Gibran? Like, what's the obvious thing that everyone should be doing?
Well, the things you both said are very obvious to me. And I would tack on something else as well. Like, I think many people are traumatized to some extent from just being a kid and being raised, and some more than others. And I noticed in myself, at least, when the pandemic and lockdowns and stuff like things happened, I really had a flinch reaction to that authoritarian ruling, and I had to figure out that a big part of that flinch reaction was trauma that was within me, like the feeling of being suppressed by my parents, in the sense of I couldn't be who I wanted to be, and it's a very long story, but I think many people that flinch towards the totalitarian side, but also towards the too much freedom side as well, comes from unsolved trauma, and maybe because we're living in such a secularized society, at least in the West, we don't really have the smaller communities of where you're going through maybe a ritual or coming of age ritual, or things where you maybe naturally would solve some of the trauma. Stuff stays there, and then you grow up. Well, you get older, but maybe there's still a child that hasn't grown up, and I think things like psychedelics and MDMA and journaling helped me to solve that. But not everyone has access to those things, and I think a very big part of that fear response towards too much order, too much chaos side is from not solving that trauma. So I think I would tack on that part. I think actually listening to other people and meditation both are actually tools to help solve part of the trauma as well. So I would tack on that one.
Rich, do you mind if I say something real fast? So for the small minority of people who are in power and setting policy, and especially who are doing messaging, one of the big problems, I just want to say this to be clear, I also really had, I got vaccinated, but I had a really hard time with the way that society handled that, because the people in charge did not tell the truth. They got caught out on lies over and over and over again, and until there was a massive, swell of mistrust, and I think that was warranted, and that wasn't, not all of that was knee jerk, like, sort of Zach De La Roca, fuck you, I won't do it, you tell me kind of stuff. It wasn't just like, idiot Americanism or whatever. It was like these, I've been lied to multiple times, and so I'm not going to get this vaccine or whatever. And I think that's fair. Like, I think a lot of people were unjustly smeared as like not caring about other people or being cowboys or whatever when they had real reasons to distrust. And so I want to say, I want to be clear that like I think that no matter your level of power, we all have responsibilities to one another, and to the extent that you can like tell the truth as you see it, right, and be open to like others' truth, like what you were talking about. It's just not. I don't want to stress that like, oh, like meditating and mindfulness and like fixing your own individual behavior is the issue here, when like, obviously there's major systemic issues as well.
Yeah. I'm glad you balanced that out. The thing I was going to say was about the flinch. Gibran, I loved you use that word, because I found it really useful just as a kind of philosophical frame to think about myself as a community of parts before you even get into the therapy of parts work, but just thinking about that as a model, as part of this fractal nested circles thing. For me, the flinch is a symptom of internal totalitarianism. It's when one of your parts flicks the switch and says, I'm going to be the dictator. There's no flexibility here. There's no room to listen. I know what's going on. I've seen this before. Everyone needs to get in line because this is life or death. Like, that's the moment where you're practicing being a dictator inside of yourself. And in the COVID moment, I think what was happening that caused the governments to be lying so much was this, like, when people flinch, they become rigid, and a rigid body is more bouncy. A soft body has got this kind of like sponginess. And it was like everyone in a state of fear and being triggered, and they get really, really firm and then any little disagreement or mistrust like pushes bounce further and further apart. And so you have everyone on their worst behavior, and what we need is people who are really supple, who can notice that moment and say, hey, I meet you in your fear and your anxiety, and it's terrifying because we don't know how bad this is going to be. And you've got reason to be scared, and I'm with you in that. And we've got to listen to the different perspectives here. And that was what was missing in most spaces. It was just like, this person is being an idiot, and the correct response to that idiot is to like defend ourselves against them and get very rigid. And we just march in opposite directions, which I think is like rippling through society still as a result.
Yeah, there was a lack of honesty, and the words didn't align with the composure of how people were acting on both TV, but also everywhere, and on either side or both sides. What's the word? Either side of the opinions that people had. And if there's no honesty, then people have no trust, and if you don't trust, you don't listen. If you don't listen, then like you say, with a beautiful example, Rich, you're rigid and you can't get to each other.
I want to double click as well something you said, Gabe. It almost sounded like you were updating your advice in real time, which was first quit the media, but then also you need to develop some critical thinking around social media as well. Because
quit the mass media, but don't just replace it with your Facebook feed, because that's still the mass media, right? So that's still,
because again, in retrospect, because I'm connected to quite a few different countries that my family lives in different parts of the world and so on, that I feel like kind of plugged into how different countries handled the pandemic. And I saw a lot of people ditch the mainstream media and embrace very wacky, well, let's say very heterodox ways of narratives and thinkers and ways of making choices. And as much as it pains me to say it as an anarchist, it seems like on balance, the people who just listened to the state and did as they were told came out better off than the free thinkers. And that was really confronting to see that a lot of the free thinkers got hypnotized by a bunch of nonsense um, and it made me think twice about my instinctive posture, which is basically anti-authoritarian. You know, it's like, oh, sometimes you need a just authority, and how do we equip people to make good choices about who they're listening to? And that is not, the answer to that is not obvious to me. Like, the stuff that we're talking about helps, I think, but when it comes to the government's clearly lying to me, these other people are saying it's something about cell phone towers. How am I supposed to make sense of my health choices for me and my family? It's not obvious to me how we navigate that.
Yeah, mass media is a really confounding variable here, where it's a really confounding variable. It's like you kind of, everyone knows you can't trust the official narrative, but the thing that's even worse than that is sort of going out into the Wild West, like, without the skills to do it. And I feel like I also don't know how to let people. I don't really know how to tell people how to be, because I got a literature degree, and my whole job was like literary theory and pulling apart text and deconstructing it, and or like my whole education was in that. So I don't tend to get suckered by stuff online as often maybe as other people. It still happens from time to time. I can still get got. But like, usually the answer to this when it comes up is like, oh, well, make sure you're getting like trusted official sources, right? And it's like, well, okay, but the trusted official sources, maybe you can kind of look at people's incentives. Maybe you can just say follow the money, right? Maybe you can say like Pfizer is a massive multinational corporation. You know, we live in the internet age. Like, would they deliberately poison billions of people? Would any corporation have ever like got to the status of being a corporation if that was their intent and not, you know, whatever? Like, probably not, right? It's like, also, like, should you trust pharmaceutical corporations? No. Right, for other reasons, you know. So it's, how do you answer this question? How do you tell people, like, where
you
to
can't
go, what
really
to do, you know? You can't, except to say develop your own capacity for the truth.
That takes a lot of work. I mean, for me as well, I studied biology and taught biology and had to read like hundreds of scientific articles, so then I know how to get through a scientific article and see, look at the statistics and things like that. But most people don't, and even the people who do don't necessarily want to take the time when a novel virus comes along and looking at the newest research, hours or sometimes days per week to make a decision. So you have to put your trust somewhere at some point, and how much you keep within your own research or your mind, or how much you put in someone else, that differs for people, and it's on an individual basis that you have to make the decision. And maybe to take it a little bit away from like the COVID and everything, this goes for all decisions within a community where we live, of course. So and maybe we have more of an idea on like science or reading stuff, but maybe not on other stuff. So we have to put our trust in other people as well on completely different topics. So but that's why I think we're in like such a maybe liminal space now. It's in the past you had a, well, let's say a tribe, however you want to define it, but a group of people between 30 and 150 or 200 people, and you knew from experience, because the group is so small, who you could trust with what. So there's a context. You trust John with whatever, picking flowers, and Daisy with blacksmithing, putting the other way around. But you get what I mean, right? But so how can we do that in this day and age of digital stuff? How do we do that? How I've no idea. So maybe you have.
Yeah, well, maybe we can't expect everyone to have the ability to, you know, like, oh, this is my nuclear expert, this is my military expert. You can't expect everyone to know everyone. But there are some meta skills there, you know. So like, basically, I used to think I was anti-authoritarian or like anti-hierarchy or something like that, and now I'm just like, no, I'm just into rapid feedback loops and good accountability, and like, if there's this novel scenario arises, like I've never had to think about a pandemic before, can I at least develop the skill of responding to a new scenario, delegating my sense making to someone, and having the feedback loop, watching what happens, and then watching how the accountability being, hey, you fucked up, and how did you respond to that? Did you double down on your lies, or did you update transparently and respect me like an adult? And if you did that, if you're accountable, then I can respect you with further decisions. And again, this is my returning to the small scale. It's like, you learn about accountability and feedback loops at the small scale because you see how people respond when their behavior is challenged. And there's, I don't know. I feel like there's a lot of people who don't even have that experience at that scale of 30 or 50 people of what accountability looks like. So why would you expect them to be able to scale that up to 250 million people and make good decisions?
Yeah, that's a great point. I did want to throw in, I have kind of a personal principle around this, which is sort of keep tabs on proven bellwether communities. You know, so like for instance, the rationalists very early on, which I'm sure everybody watching this knows who the rationalists are. You know, San Francisco tech types. Very early on, they called the pandemic. They were like, you know, and because that chatter was there, and because that chatter, it was convincing to me because these were some of the most smart and skeptical people I knew, who were, you know, looking at this, posting their own data, being very transparent about how they came to their conclusions, and saying, "See for yourself." Right? You don't I don't need to convince you of this, because I can just give this to you and trust you that you will find the same conclusion. Right? And when enough of these people did this, that were like, you should be stocking up on toilet paper. Like I went out and did, you know, and I feel very lucky about that because I sort of beat most people to the stores about COVID and those sorts of things, and was able to sort of stock up and not have a panic situation in my house, which is really good. And since then, right, some people came out of that community, and obviously the problems with rationalists are well known, like tongue in cheek. Like I have, you know, I'm one of the post-rationalist, you know, type people on Twitter or whatever. But the rationalists, broadly speaking, the things that they're so committed to showing their work, and they're so committed to finding the truth as they understand it, which is, you know, sort of like purely objective, which is whatever. We don't get into that. To me, they're a proven bellwether community. To me, that's like I really trust that what's going to come out of that community is going to be something that I can assess, and that it's going to be high quality stuff, even if they don't get it right all the time. So that would be my recommendation to anyone is like, before you put your faith in something that sounds good, or that especially before you put your faith in something that like confirms a bunch of your beliefs, like really check their track record and make sure that you're not getting taken.
Even that though gives me a little concern, because I feel like there's people that have had a good track record, that were good to listen to, that were heterodox thinkers, and then they build an audience around being heterodox, and then they develop a kind of default posture of just like the opposite of what everyone else is saying, and they get kind of captured by the audience and start saying nonsense.
The contrarian guy.
Yeah, which is why you need feedback loops and to be sampling from lots of diverse sources, right? And
this is a very sneaky way to conform.
Yeah.
So, you know, very sneaky way to stay plugged into the current thing. Right?
Exactly. Maybe quick question for Rich, because a bunch of others I got answered. I was thinking I heard you say the idea of an island of coherence. How would you say, maybe in short, how would you define it, and how would it relate to what we've been talking about now?
Yeah, I mean that's a complex systems thing, you know. And when complex system is far from equilibrium. The small islands of coherence have disproportionate influence. That's coming from thinking about how particles work in a physics system or something like that. But I just translate that into a social system, meaning we're obviously far from equilibrium. It seems obvious to me that we're like accelerating. Like I said, there's more order and more chaos simultaneously. Like all the possibilities are just accelerating in all directions. And then for me, it's like, how do you make good choices in that context? What do you take responsibility for? And for me, it's like, I'm creating a little island of coherence, a little bubble of sanity. And for you, it might be your family. You know, I'm not planning to have kids, but I'm doing something that's quite similar, I think, in the community building project, which is, can we establish a boundary and say, inside this boundary, we operate on a different set of norms. We're not so swayed by the currents of whatever's popular right now. We've got a different way of making sense and making choices. And the hope is that we're sane. We're a bit more sane than the prevailing culture. And I'm certainly not counting on my specific community to be the right one, but working at the scale of many, many, many communities which are decoupled from each other and independent gives me a better sense of optimism. That some of us will be these bellwether communities. Some of us will be talking sense when it's really needed. And that we'll have sufficient relationship between us that, I mean, the rationalist is a great example, that when it comes to a pandemic, when the rationalists say it's time to stock up on toilet paper, that message is going to ripple through all of these little islands of coherence and people will snap on. But if the question is like my spiritual health, I'm going to listen to a different community, you know? But yeah, it's like, how do we stay sober when we're flooded by intoxicants as soon as you leave your house? That's kind of the project for me.
Awesome, beautifully concise. Gabe, I think maybe before we're gonna stop, do you also have maybe like some last words, or both of you? I asked you a question, Rich, but maybe you both want to say something else and around this.
I feel like we covered and had a pretty good productive discussion, and really got to like dig into some ideas. But I think we kind of complicated it, which is good. I wish I had another like hour with you guys. I feel like, like I would want to get more into practical stuff. Yeah. I personally believe there's no way to scale this work, and one of the big reasons I got into coaching, and that I'm going to start a program to pursue becoming a therapist, precisely for this reason, is that I think some work can only be done at the individual level, and to some extent scale and intimacy are antonyms, and intimacy is like in a lot of ways the whole thing that's missing here. It's like totalitarianism sort of isn't, can't happen, or it's like can only happen in the absence of intimacy with the self and with your community and with others. So that's, this is like, I would love to get more into the practicalities of this. I would love to get more into that stuff, but we ran out of time. But I am really grateful for having had this conversation, and maybe especially Gibran for hosting, and Rich for your gentle challenging of everything. I think was like really productive. Really brought out a lot of good stuff. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Gabe. Awesome. And Rich, do you have something to share as well, or?
Yeah, I can say it was kind of refreshing for me to be more at the theoretical, because I'm always at the practical. Like you've got the literature degree, but I've got an engineering degree. I'm usually just like bolting things together, and for me it's really obvious. The practice side of things is very obvious, and that's the micro solidarity project. Is all this like you need to get yourself into a community of practice. That's how we scale intimacy. It's not, you don't bring everyone into the room together, but you publish the blueprints for how to make a great room for therapeutic encounters. Reading Charles Dickens is an intimate experience that billions of people have had, So we can scale intimacy. It's an engineering challenge from my perspective. But yeah, I've also got an appetite to have this conversation go on for twice as long. So we can just end with an ellipsis, and maybe we'll see each other again.
Maybe do a part 2.
Yeah. Thanks, Gibran.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and just one more thing. Is a space where people can find you, or I can put links to anything you want in like the YouTube channel or on Twitter. Where should people go if they want to hear from you, or maybe do coaching with you, Gabe, or your micro solidarity project, Rich?
I've just got my Twitter right now. It's at VividVoid. It's a little underscore at the end of it. That's the best place to get a hold of me. That's kind of my only web presence right now. So.
All right.
Yeah, and I'm Rich Decibels on Twitter, and it's my favorite place to talk to people. Don't send me an email. Don't send me a DM. Just hang out with me in public. Microsolidarity.cc is the website. It's got a lot of resources for community building. And we're going to have a gathering in Denver at the end of October. So anyone in that part of the world, please come hang out with me.
That's not too far.
Yeah.
Ooh.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. I'll be talking to you in public about that.
Great. My preference.
All right. Guys, thank you very much. And I would like to go into the practicalities maybe as well. I even had some questions that are more practical around other stuff. So maybe we can do that next time. Thank you very much, and have a nice day and a nice evening, guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye, guys.